We can see it.
Okay, yay.
It is, yeah.
All right.
Happy afternoon, everyone. I hope you're all doing well, enjoying the different sessions today. So many great ideas and resources. So I think it's time to start, so I'll make you all welcome. I'm Laura Smith from the University of New Hampshire, and I'm working alongside Danny Rimbach-Jones, who will be managing the Zoom technology for us. So you can contact, if you have a question, you can put that in the chat as well. Please note that this session is being recorded, and we ask that you please mute yourselves and minimize your use of apps to help with bandwidth. And to ensure time for presenters, we have reserved some time at the end for questions for both presentations. You can share your comments and questions in chat. And I think Jeff Kaplan has also said he welcomes you to unmute if you wanted to chime in with a question during the presentation as well. So, and now I'd like to welcome our presenters today. We have Angela Insenga from West Georgia University, and the title you can see here on the screen, and the share screen. So, Reconciling the Present Through the Past, Histo-Spec Texts, Their Paranormal Pathways and Practical Pedagogy for Adolescent Learners. And then next will be followed by Jeff Kaplan of the University of Central Florida and Jean Brown, Rhode Island College, who can't be with us today, titled Avoiding the Censors, Developing Good Rationale Instead of Good Intentions. So before we start, any questions from anyone in the audience? All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Angela then. The Zoom is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So I'm going to do three things. I'm actually going to read a little bit to you. I'm going to show you some things. I'm going to ask for your help in a couple cases. And I'm actually going to show you some student exemplars from some of the work that we've done, my student teachers and I. So I've got a lot to do. First, I'll just start with kind of the genesis of this project. In the third edition of Young Adult Lit, From Romance to Realism, Michael Cart produces what he calls a State of the Genre report, in which he notes, quote, after a decade of obsessively focusing on speculative fiction, we are finally returning to a renaissance of realistic fiction. Cart credits this shift to John Green, Rainbow Rowell, among others, whose texts, I guess, possess a fealty to adolescent experience and do not utilize amplification. So think, I guess, vegetarian vampires, Titus and Fee going to the moon and having a shit time, or sorting hats, things like that. And I actually really responded to this because I know my students here at the University of West Georgia enjoy realism and the texts that we look at together. So I put together, in the process of putting together, a realism-themed course in 2017, and I found several texts existing in this odd borderland between these two types of young adult lit. And then I, of course, as a geeky English major professor, theorized formally, thinking about different structures and theoretical premises, frameworks in which something like this could exist. So in the location of culture, Homi Bhabha, post-colonialist theorist, clarifies the role between spaces, between literal and highly symbolic competing cultures. He writes, in the emergence of the interstices, the overlap and displacement of domains of difference, he calls them intersubjective and collective experiences of nationness or community interest, are negotiated. So in communities where culture, geopolitics, economic modes conflict, groups navigate the discourse and negotiate for space. He also sees liminality in art, and this got me closer to thinking about my own project. He actually points to this incredibly famous 1991 art installation by African-American artist Renee Green. And she actually decided to utilize the building as part of her artistic presentation. So she had an attic space, she had a stairwell, and then she used another room as a boiler room. And so that became part of her logic, the geometry of the art piece. And the art piece was dedicated to the relationship that Black people have to white culture, especially in the 90s. And so he's drawn to that. And I loved that he used a piece of art because, well, that's what I want to do too. And so I began thinking about this liminal space that opens up as like a stairway or a corridor, an umbilical cord, if you will, as I'm thinking about these books that don't fit into either speculative or realist. So the text I want to talk about today fit into this, our field's kind of ever-growing body of work. And I decided to call them Histo-Spec texts with narrative structures that I also call the paranormal pathway. And I think we always ask, for whom are these books? Where do they belong? I would say age-appropriate literature belongs in this middle school or secondary classrooms, and the books I'm going to talk today fit in both. And of course, I'm going to start, I have to, it's hardwired, I'm so sorry. They fit with our standards, right? We have to teach structure of text. We must look at narrative. And we begin often then by thinking about the goals. We call them milestone tests here, and we do have them in our standards. I like the idea too of inquiry-based learning and interdisciplinarity that these texts can provide. And I really love this set of questions from Bigelow, in which she encourages folks reading historical fiction to really analyze and think through the gaps or the places where you have a kind of adherence to what happened and why. And so I love that idea of asking students to sort of exist between the historical fiction and the real. And that, of course, brings us into interdisciplinarity, which at least here, our middle school teachers are required to kind of collab plan. And so it works really well with history and ELA, I think. The next thing that's really important to me as a teacher, and you'll see a bit of it today, is multimodal expression. I've begun using multimodality, multiliteracies in the last 4 or 5 years to ask my English majors to produce more than writing, which often scares them initially, but then they realize that they have proclivities for certain kinds of work, certain kinds of interest level, interest areas outside of English. And so I've kind of lined up here for you some of the folks who are the founders of and those who talk about multimodal expression and ask us to stop thinking about the typical academic paper as the site of learning and to give students more agency in what they do. So I think for me, the Jewett's, the time for habitual conjunction of language, print literacy, and learning is over. It's sort of this moment of shock, especially if you've devoted your life to teaching writing. But I think that it's true. We have to kind of talk more about what's beyond only academic writing. And then I think a lot about this idea of what else can Histo-Spec with paranormal pathway narratives do. And I've already presented a little bit on this elsewhere. I think that at least one of our texts actually encourage students to think about activism. So to think about social justice and activism, build empathy and sympathetic response to another. Microhistories are also part of what I can teach when I look at these Histo-Spec texts with the paranormal pathway. And I like the idea that students get to flex. They would use that in a slang way, I think, but I like the idea of they're flexing the spatial and structural awareness talents. And then, of course, they keep reading, pulled in and through the narrative corridor, no matter what the olds are up to in the summer, going to a summit together. So I really like that all of these goals seem to have worked for me and for my students who've been able to go out and teach some of these texts. So I'm going to talk about 3 books today. The first is Ghost Boys by Jewel Parker Rhodes from 2018. And I want to lay out for you what I see in the narrative and the structure of that narrative. The narrative, of course, is horribly familiar. Jerome, a 12-year-old middle schooler in Chicago, is killed by a police officer outside of his home while he's playing with a toy gun that his friend Carlos gave him, so kind of shared with him to play with. Officer Moore, the man who kills him, testifies that he feared for his life when Jerome pointed a gun at him, and classifies Jerome as at least 25, a man, a dangerous man. And in some ways, I think Rhodes is alluding to that famous 2014 study, which found that Black male children are not afforded the same protections that others in the same developmental category are given. They actually experience kind of harsh realities similar to those experienced by adults, and worse, are dehumanized. And I have found that this book rehumanizes Jerome through this narration of the events before and after his own death, this paranormal pathway. So the book is divided into alternating sections entitled Dead and Alive. And the novel focuses on these important moments in which Jerome learns about the dead he encounters, watches his family, and later he breaks through the wall between death and life using a paranormal pathway to communicate with Sarah, his killer's daughter.
Paisley's doing one at her house. Okay.
Could you mute?
Hold on just one moment. I'm going to work on
Okay, I'm so sorry to stop.
Nice. Do you want to go get some tonight?
I don't have power.
So you're going to get one tonight. You want to go get it tonight?
I wonder if I do.
Yeah, what just hold on. I just missed completely.
Okay, I'm so sorry.
Did your screen freeze?
No, there was someone who I guess her mute. I actually just muted her. I pressed the button and it happened. So
Yes.
I'm so sorry.
I was searching and I'm like, I can't find the person.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm so sorry to get disrupted, and hold on, all right. Okay, so I'm talking about Ghost Voice, and the text is divided into alternating sections entitled Dead and Alive, and it focuses on these moments in which Jerome learns about the dead he encounters. So he sees others who are in the afterlife. He watches his family, and later he is basically instructed to break through a wall between life and death using a paranormal pathway to communicate with Sarah, his killer's daughter. So on the opening page, Jerome's spirit stoops and stares at his body, reflecting how small I look, laid out flat, my stomach touching ground. I'm dead. I thought I was bigger, tough, but I'm just a bit of nothing. So these reflections occur in alive sections as Jerome slowly remembers his circumstance. So he kind of reflects backwards and forwards at the same time, kind of crossing this divide, almost as if he's not ready to be dead. Ghost Boys does more than illustrate flashbacks, more than, as my student Sarah said this past semester, re-traumatize us Black students in and outside of the classroom. In the dead sections, Rhodes links Jerome's shooting and the death to the murder of Emmett Till, illustrating a long legacy of violence against African American male adolescents. And this dialectic structure produces tension between Jerome as a newly dead boy who cannot yet forget his life, and Till, who is in charge of welcoming him into the afterlife, into the Ghost Boys gang. Eventually, Till, the leader of the Ghost Boys, initiates Jerome into the afterlife via what I see as a highly symbolic synthesis of his death and Jerome's. So like Jerome's story, Till's story is also conveyed in pieces by Rhodes, culminating with a full description of the events that occurred in Money, Mississippi on August 28th, 1955. Jerome first meets the ghost of Emmett Till at his own wake, where Till tells him, time to wake up. And it reminds me a lot of Spike Lee. I don't know if she pulled that in, but that's one of his kind of famous lines to start almost every one of his films. Till's described as wispy, like soft rain. He's a brown boy with black velvet eyes that stare and stare. And eventually Jerome begins to learn parts of Emmett's life, and other ghost boys join the duo as well. A boy called Tamir, who is graceful. There's a fly, hip ghost boy from Florida wearing a gray hoodie as well. So you've got Rhodes, again, intermingling these worlds. In a chapter titled Listening, Jerome learns the full truth of Emmett's death and connects his own murder to Till's in Mississippi. He she blurs the outlines between the boys' bodies as Emmett's eyes, widening pools, pull Jerome in. So they almost become superimposed. So in superimposing the phantom and the corporeal bodies of Jerome and Emmett, we have a historical path from present to past, highlighting this dehumanization. Both boys suffer, and of course, we have a long legacy, historical legacy. Jerome's initiation, though, into the Ghost Boy gang requires him to traverse a paranormal pathway in this Histo-Spec novel. Emmett tells him that he must share his story with those whose sensitivities allow them to see him. It's Officer Moore's living daughter, Sarah, who sees Jerome's ghost as a small boy, contrary to her father's claims. So then she begins to question her father. And of course, she learns through Jerome about Emmett Till. And eventually, she invites her father, after connecting with Jerome, being able to see him, to create a website with her about slain youth. And that, of course, in some ways hits a little wooden, right? Even Jerome wonders, can a white girl help change the world through a website, right? But Emmett reminds him in the text that somebody else was sensitive enough to see his own murder, and that man was Thurgood Marshall. So you can see Rhodes trying to again give that gravitas to what Sarah and Jerome have been able to do. So the living and the dead mingle in this narrative corridor between worlds, and Emmett insists that the ghost boys invoke change. And I love this last words of this text. If you've read it, I love the idea that you have, and this is the form in which it's written. You've got bear, wake, live, and tell, this sort of imperative verbs kind of reaching out to us too, from beyond where Jerome and Emmett are. And so you've got one text here that has a very specific historical event. And then of course, here, my students and I, we actually in class talked about the historical events, and we talked about what we saw in the text, and of course the gaps that existed. The next, in this case, it's an ongoing series, is by A.J. Hartley. It's Cold Bath Street, and it is what he calls a kind of love song to his town. Preston, Lancashire, and it takes place on September 15th, 1978, and years prior. The protagonist is named Preston Oldcorn, and he, like Jerome, dies at the beginning of the book, and he spends much of the narrative exploring the borderland between life and death, what is called by a boy he meets the merely dead and the sincerely dead. So you've got, again, this kind of sense that there's these layers that exist between living and dead. Cold Bath Street provides a microhistory of a town, Preston, that exists in what Oldcorn calls no man's land, in which historical events of record and well-worn ghost stories characterize Preston's history. And in this borderland, Preston sees his town as it was in various time periods. So there's a kind of layering that goes on. The one central location would be the tunnels, the Long Ridge Railway system that actually brought Preston into the industrial age. And so a lot takes place on these train tracks and in the Miley Tunnel, where apparently people still go and ghost hunt. That was the picture that started my presentation, by the way. That's the Miley Tunnel. So the mixture of real and metaphysical musings provide a fuller portrait of events, beliefs, and attitudes in Preston. Oldcorn, for example, encounters Roman centurions from a real settlement at Ribchester that dates from 78 AD. Romans occupied the Ribchester for 300 years, and the soldiers were mostly cavalry. Along with the remains of a settlement in Preston are reports of paranormal activity that match Preston's experience. People have had sightings of a Roman legion marching along the avenue, but they walk in the ground as if on a different level of land, because over time, the ground has shifted. The level of the ground has shifted and changed. And of course, he sees this as well. So you get Hartley mingling these things together. Preston Old Corn is also terrified of the Banister doll ghost story, which dates from the 19th century and served as a cautionary tale for young women. Dolly Banister told her father she was pregnant. She was one of the most beautiful girls in Preston. And raged at her impropriety, he took her into the street and apparently beat her to death. She is said, therefore, to haunt the streets seeking vengeance, especially after 2 young men turned up murdered mysteriously. So you've got this kind of setting of this mythos, this legend ghost story. Hartley actually talks about this in an afterword and believes that this kind of oral tale took on Victorian social mores with the rise of Industrial Revolution. And after seeing these historical and pseudo-historical figures, Preston flees to his house. Somebody new lives at his house, and I guess Preston's Sarah is named Tracy. And so he communes with a girl named Tracy, and they're unable to speak at first because he doesn't know how to cross the paranormal pathway, but he actually does charades, and they kind of write to each other, and it is through those writings and the history that the ever intrepid Tracy researches to find that he actually can go back to the land of the merely dead and usher them into the sincerely dead. And so this becomes a story about Preston, learning about Preston and ushering the kind of tortured souls from both historical and these ghost stories to the sincerely dead. And I really love this idea that it is through Tracy's research and Preston learning from her that he can go back and what he sees as righting wrongs. You could see kind of why that is Hartley's love story to his hometown, right? So the third Histo-Spec text that has a paranormal pathway in it is called Asylum. It's the Asylum series. There's a trilogy, but then she wrote one more, so I guess it's a quadrilogy. It offers a broad examination of treatment for the mentally ill from the 19th century onward. So again, we're moving from a very specific event to the history of place to a historical concept that is something that I think affects many people as they are moving forward into getting mental help for mental health. Like the other novels, she makes use of a paranormal pathway device, but it's a little bit different. So while Rhode draws a parallel between Jerome's murder and that of Emmett Till, Rue uses pieces of historical records, blending the past with the present in characters who have relational ties to her setting. So these are actually pictures included in the text. So I wanted to kind of bring them in. They're historical pictures. Sometimes she's had them drawn as well. And so her setting is a sanatorium, which has been renovated and serves now as a school. So from the 19th to 20th century, it's called Brookline. 3 friends attending a summer institute, Dan, Abby, and Jordan, encounter vestiges of the past in their dorm, where this is kind of a weak part of the text, where they can still kind of break into rooms and find equipment, pictures, and old patient records. So as if it's just been left there. And much like Rhodes and Hartley's novel, Rue employs conventional narrative devices to build a portrait of the past, but unlike them, she fashions what I kind of call a melange of historical artifacts. So things in a place that become the conduit, and in accumulating these historical bits, you get this kind of mosaic. The other thing that's interesting is that this multimodality that shows the suffering of those locked away in sanitariums offers us also a connection between Dan and the people who worked there in the past. And so you get this blending of people, again, whereas you get the superimposition of Jerome and Emmett for just that moment. Here, it's the people who become connected over time. And so you have, for example,
so we have about one more minute.
Okay, I thought I had 6. I'm sorry. Okay. In any case, what I will do now then, with my 1 more minute, is kind of look at what my students have done with this idea. And so I'm thinking more of geometry of the text, They created this narrative, and this was, again, something that they wrote assignment sheets for. So I have them write hypothetical assignment sheets. You can see this bridge here with the paranormal pathway, Jerome moving to and fro. They really were intent on having this historical record of unjust death that precedes and exceeds our time. So they wanted that timeline to stretch beyond the bridge they created. Here's a class of students who looked at the Miley Tunnel as this place where the climax of the novel takes place. It's kind of reckoning. And then the tunnel's the conduit. And lastly, you have this real and the residue. This class was really into this text, Asylum, and they looked a lot at the real people and, of course, how the residue of Brookline and the history of the mental health treatment affected them. And so they really wanted to kind of focus on the real and the residue and how those connected. Finally, I'm always interested if you're thinking about more Histo-Spec texts as you're sitting here listening to me. I've got 2 more that I'm working on right now, Glow by Megan Bryant and The Dictionary of Lost Words by Pip Williams, which I'm about half through. I had planned to finish it before my presentation, but I thought my presentation was tomorrow, so I did not finish that text yet. So if you have others, I'm so interested in them. I'm really keen to work with these kinds of texts and look at this narrative structure. Thank you for listening.
Well, thank you so much. All right.
How do I stop sharing?
So up at the top of the screen. Yeah. All right. So thank you. And so Angela will hopefully have a few minutes for questions and responses at the end. I'd like to turn it over to Jeff Kaplan now. And you need to unmute.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you, Angela, for a provocative and most interesting presentation. I consider where adolescents and adults would get into that in great detail. Thank you very much. My presentation is going to be about book rationales and dealing with difficult text. Let me introduce myself. I'm Jeff Kaplan. I teach at the University of Central Florida. I'm an emeritus professor. I'm former president of Allen. I also work at Grand Canyon University in the College of Doctoral Studies. And I've long been interested, of course, in young adult literature and bringing good books to kids in classrooms and working with teachers and realizing that when all is said and done, a school is still a school, and it often happens to be an environment that it stays conventionally normal in the sense that the standards are never changed from year to year. We'd like to change the standards from time to time, but they remain somewhat traditional, and it's our job as teachers to maybe break the ice and make those traditions not as standard as they usually are. I want to begin though with an exercise, and I'd like some people to participate. Feel free to unmute and share as you like and show yourself in your picture. I always like to see the people that I'm working with. I'd like you to get out a piece of paper if you have one in front of you and divide it into 4 squares. You can either share your answer aloud or share it in the text. And each one of the squares, I'd like you to write down the following things. 1, and many of you, I guess, imagine are or were a high school, middle school, or English teacher or something of that nature. What is a book that you taught in high school or middle school that you remember to this day that your kids really like? What is a book that you taught? And just write down the name of that book. And after you put in the first square of your window-looking box the name of the book that you taught as a high school or middle school teacher, or are teaching or plan to teach in the years to come, what is the book that you would like to teach or would have liked to teach to young people? So you've written down the book that you did taught or did teach, and you written down a book that you would like to teach. In the third square, I'd like you to write the name of a book that you would be hesitant to teach. That you would be hesitant to teach. So you've written down a book that you did teach, or then you wrote down a book that you would like to teach, and then you wrote down the name of a book that you would be hesitant to teach. And then the fourth box, write down the name of a student you remember who was a voracious reader. Somebody you think that just loved to read, no matter what the time or day. So those 4 squares in repetition is a book that you did teach, like to teach, would be hesitant to teach, and the name of a voracious reader. And just for the sake of argument, is there anybody who would like to share? Anybody want to share? I see Steve Bickmore wrote A Separate Piece to Kill a Mockingbird, a book he'd like to teach. All American Boys, Wrecked, and Tracy King is a person that he remembers. Anybody else want to share aloud? I know we're hesitant in a large group because we really don't know each other. Let's see, I'll just read the text here. The Part-Time Indian, Between the World and Me, and Fight Club. So number one was Part-Time Indian, Between the World and Me, and Fight Club. Stephanie said The Giver. Then she said The Marrow, and then Themes and Homecoming and Mario. Good. Let's see. Jen says Orbiting Jupiter, American Boys, The Hate You Give, and Ava Scepter. Good. Anyone else want to share? Christy O'Day said Lord of the Flies, Just Mercy, Dear Martin, and a girl named Greta. Joanne Williams said Among the Hidden, Rain Is Not My Indian Name, Apple, and then Anthony Modigliano. And Ms. Ah said The Pigman, The Road, Great Gatsby, and Adrian Diaz. Anybody else? Well, this was another one, Running Loose, Apple, a book I won't name that I didn't notice is Unkind to a Trans Teen. And then Brandon. Okay. Anybody else? Well, good. That's a good sampling of what we're talking about. The reason I bring this up is because I'm always reminded of a story that I lived. And the story is very simple. When I first started teaching, there were no books that really primarily dealt with kids of color. There were certainly no books that dealt primarily with kids who have a different sexual orientation than heterosexual. There were certainly no books that dealt with children of a different ethnicity other than Caucasian. Yet they were good books, but they were just the tip of the iceberg of what was to come. One of the great things about young adult literature, and I don't have to tell this group, is that young adult literature is always on the cutting edge. Always on the cutting edge of what society is dealing with. Because young people remain ahead of us when it comes to social understandings. And teachers, the reason I love working with teachers so much is because teachers are the foot soldiers for social change. Every social concern that happens in our greater world, nationally, locally, or internationally, lands first on a teacher's desk. Teachers deal with divorce, and kids who are feeling bullied or left alone, or kids who believe that they're gay and can't admit it, or kids who are going through a gender transformation, or kids who have suffered from relatives who have addiction problems. Every social concern, issue, good, bad, or ill, lands first on a teacher's desk. And books, by their magic, have the ability to save lives when the teacher finds the right book for the right kid. I remember the first year I taught in 1977, believe it or not. I had 3 kids in my room who I remember to this very day. One was a reader. She's like the 4th box of that drawing. That reader read every single day, no matter what I was doing in class. I would give the lesson and that child read. And at that time, the books that she read were the books that were popular at that time. All Creatures Great and Small, Watership Down. She just read. She didn't care what I was saying or what I was doing, and she read. She did my assignments, she did them exceptionally well, and then she went back to reading. She was just a natural, voracious reader. One was a boy in the back of the room who did anything but read. He just kind of sat there and played with his pencil and picked on other kids until one day he walked by my desk and he noticed on my desk was a book that had a hot rod on it. And at that time was a souped up car. And he looked at the book, and he walked back my bed, and then he walked back again, and he looked at the book again, and now thinking I knew it, he picked up the book and read the first page. And then he read the second page. And then he read the third page, and then, much to my happiness, he sat and read. And I guarantee you that was probably the first book he ever read from cover to cover. Was it The Great Gatsby? No. Was it War and Peace? No. But it was a book that turned him on to reading. And to this day, I remember the power of how books can save lives. Then there was another young lady who introduced me to the value of young adult literature, because at that time I had a very traditional education where the English classes I taught and took in college were not about young adult literature. They were about Dickens and Twain and Hemingway and all the great writers that we know of. And she said, Mr. Kaplan, at that time, she said, Mr. Kaplan, I want you to read this book. I said, okay. And thinking I was going to take the book and put it in my desk and pretend I had read it. And when she came back over the weekend and say, wasn't that a great book? And I'd say, yes. And tell me about the part. And she would explain the whole book to me. Except the book she handed to me was intriguing. And I opened up the first page of the book and I began to read. And then I read the second page. And then I read the third page. And I spent the weekend reading that book. And I said, this book has transformed not only my life, but my teaching. And if you haven't guessed already, the book was called A Wrinkle in Time by Madeleine L'Engle. And it's the book that introduced me to the beauty and value and creativity of young adult books, because no one had shown me that book until this day. And I had gone to all the fancy schools and taken all the English courses and grammar courses you need to take, and no one had introduced me to that book, except this young girl who showed me this book, and I bonded with her about this book, because this book was about people who are exceptionally bright, lost in time, and she was exceptionally bright, kind of lost in her own time. Now, I bring this up because I want you to understand that the reason I love working with people who work with young adult literature is because we are the people who care more about the that than the what. And what do I mean by that? Most curriculum that you get handed in public school education is concerned with the what you are teaching, right? If you're a high school English teacher or a middle school English teacher, they hand you a textbook and it's filled with the short stories and poems that they'd like you to teach. And if it's American literature, it has the standard American literature things. And if it's British literature, it's the standard British literature things. And if it's middle school, it has the standard poems from Langston Hughes and the like. But when I was a very young English teacher, I realized immediately there's not anything in this book that relates to the kids that I'm teaching. Nothing. It's all about poems and plays about people who are much older than they are and going through things and difficulties that they have beyond their ken. So I had to go looking for young adult books. I had to go looking for books that would gather to them and relate to them and meaning to them. And then I realized that the reason those books were not on the top of their shelf or in my book is because many of those books deal with real things. Drugs and alcohol and sex and abuse and sexuality. And that's difficult. No one will ever fault you for not using those books in class. No principal will ever come to you and say, you're not using young adult literature that speaks to kids. Only you can make that choice. But you also live in a world that's very traditional. Very traditional in the sense that you and you alone can make the choices. I've always lived by one credo when it comes to teaching. I like it. I think my kids will like it. I think it makes a difference in good teaching. I like it. I think my kids will like it. I think it'll make a difference in good teaching. And every assignment I've ever done in middle school or high school and in college is based on that principle. How does it relate to me and to my students and to the world of teaching? Will it make a difference? Now, certain books you can teach in high school and middle school and nobody will question you. You and I know they might not be appropriate for them to read because they're not ready to read them. But you and I know that if you bring certain books into the classroom that others consider to be inappropriate, your life can become, pardon the expression, a living hell. So my job here in the next couple of minutes is help you navigate so that you can bring great books to great kids and still keep your job. And the way you do that is you learn to be a diplomat. My mother was a middle school English teacher, and at the time she wanted to teach The Chocolate War by Robert Cormier. The Chocolate War is probably one of the best young adult novels ever written, because Robert Cormier was the kind of writer who didn't pander. He wasn't a sitcom writer, he wasn't a scary writer, he was a writer who was meticulous in his presentation of the human character and human development. Very few young adult novelists reach that level of perfection. And his book is about a young boy who defies a prep school because they want to sell chocolates to raise money, and he doesn't want to participate in it. And not only does he have to defy his peers, he has to defy the individuals who run the prep school. And in the middle of the book is not only harsh language, but questions about religion and Catholicism, and all the tough questions that young people go through, which you won't find in Hemingway or Great Gatsby or Romeo and Juliet. And if it is, it's disguised. But in Robert Cormier, it was blatant. My mother knew this was a great book because kids were going to wrestle with issues that she felt were very important. So she did what she thought was the wise thing to do. No teacher wants to be caught in the middle of a censorship war, right? We don't make that kind of money that we can walk away and say, oh, I'll do something else. I'll go work on Wall Street. I'll go sell life insurance. I don't need this job. If you're like me, you need this job, right? And every dollar you get is precious. And you love everything that goes with teaching. But you also like the fact that you make a difference. So my mother went to her middle school principal and said, here's the book I want to teach. It's The Chocolate War by Robert Cormier. And I bet you that principal had no knowledge of that book, not because the principal was ignorant, just because it's a very specialized book. It's not on the bestseller list at the time. It was a book that people knew, but it wasn't movie of the week. But she carefully explained what the book was about. And she said, here are the things in this book that probably will get me into some sort of trouble with my parents if they know that their child is reading this book, especially in a middle school setting, without their knowledge. Can I teach this book? And he said to her, I'll tell you what, I'll go home and read the book. I'll come back and let you know. He read the book. He came back and said, you may teach this book. I want you to do one thing. What? I want you to inform your parents that you're going to teach this book, and I want them to know what's in this book before you teach it. And I want them to sign a letter, because no principal likes to get a call on a Friday afternoon saying, you know what Mrs. Kaplan's doing in her 7th grade class, right? Because then it becomes a political culture war, right? For the last 4 years of the Trump administration, we sat through a culture war. It was done deliberately. They knew they could fire up one side to blast the other side. But no teacher can take that stand and live through it, because, you know, we'll get somebody else to teach Romeo and Juliet and Shakespeare and Hemingway and all the books that we consider to be standard, right? Nobody at the Chamber of Commerce is going to come running to you and say, how come you taught The Great Gatsby? How come you taught Johnny Tremaine, right? They'll come running at you if they find out you have books that have dirty words in it. So you have to learn something that is special to being a teacher, and that is to be a politician. So what my mother did is she wrote that letter, and she penned that letter, and she said, this is what the book is about. Please sign this permission slip. And every parent did. And then she could go ahead and teach the book. Now, I tell you this because the books that we've talked about today and we'll talk about tomorrow are books that nobody could have imagined when I was teaching in 1970 and 1980. Right? If you taught Catcher in the Rye, you were considered a heretic, because Catcher in the Rye had dirty words. Right? The books that we teach today are so valuable and so important to kids. You know, I wish I had these books when I was a kid. I always say, you don't believe diversity is important? Imagine growing up and watching television and you never saw anybody who looked like you on television. Imagine you were Asian and you grew up in the 1950s and 60s and watched television, and the only person you saw on television who was Asian was maybe the butler. Or you're Jewish, right? And you knew the characters were Jewish, but they were afraid to mention that they were Jewish in fear of annoying the audience and inflaming the sponsors. Or you were Black, and you were Black and middle class. Were there characters on television who were Black and middle class? Teachers are the foot soldiers of social change, but they cannot afford to go out on a limb and lose all their respect and maybe their position if they don't develop allies. The key to developing good book rationales is, one, to know the book you're going to teach, why you're going to teach it, and to develop allies in your school who will help you teach it. It's easy as a teacher to close the classroom door and say, I'll just do this book and nobody will know. Well, we all know the answer to that question. Everybody will know. Everybody will know. They'll say, you know what Mr. Kaplan's reading in his classroom? Oh my gosh. And you know the dirty words, right? Now, I encourage every teacher to have a bookshelf. And every teacher to have a bookshelf filled with books that you think are important for kids to read, because the voracious readers will find them. And they're so used to reading everything, it'll just go right by them. And their parents are probably going to be, okay, yeah, sure, let them read. But if you're going to do a class novel, I encourage you to develop political allies in your school to help you teach that book. The National Council of Teachers in English develops wonderful rationales for teaching controversial books, but the best rationale is the one that you come up with and the allies you develop in your classroom.
Oh, thank you so much.
You're welcome, Laura.
Thank you. So I think we have about 4 or 5 minutes left for comments and questions for Angela and Jeff, if you'd like to share them in the chat or if you'd like to unmute. So people are sharing some of the NCTE resources that you've just mentioned.
Yeah. I just want to emphasize again the what and the that. I think that's what separates us from other people in this profession, is that, you know, lots of people are content with the what. You know, you hand kids, I read this when I went to high school, you should read it, Romeo and Juliet and, you know, The Great Gatsby and Hemingway and the like. But we are the people that are concerned with that. You know, my daughter didn't start out reading Hemingway. She started reading a book about the Backstreet Boys because that's what interests her. And then you go from there. I just believe that kids who are reading develop a vocabulary inside their head that helps them cope with the world. And that we as teachers have to learn to be politicians to share that with everybody else, because lots of people are more concerned with the what. I mean, I woke up this morning in the state of Florida and our dear governor says that we can no longer teach critical race theory, as if we were teaching critical race theory. No, as if high school teachers were, that's the first thing on their agenda. But what he's applying is that we cannot be critical of our government inside a public school classroom. And I couldn't think of anything more horrible than that.
So we have about 3 minutes left, and there's a great question in the chat. Besides wishing for more time for this session, someone asks, so how can we incorporate some of these diversified voices when we are working with a mandated curriculum that is only the classic canon? So Angela and Jeff, do you want to respond?
Angela, you have a response to that?
In our state, we have several pathways towards doing that. Since the Common Core, the advent of the Common Core here, we now call it GSE. It's the same Common Core though, they just changed the name. They have the reading informational standards. And so I've been able to infiltrate when so many teachers call and ask me, how can I teach this reading informational standard? I know what I could do with the literary, but how do I teach the informational? And so that's where I've actually been able to put in a lot of historical fiction and encourage interdisciplinarity, especially in middle grades. So sometimes what schools here do is they reach out, and then of course my student teachers, they go in and teach and bring what we've talked about in young adult lit, which is always, this kind of method of not just finding allies, but doing some research. What books, what awards has this? I always go back to Bushman and Haas. I know we got lots of fancy stuff, but 4th edition, Bushman and Haas, page 263, gives you 8 things you need to do if you want a book in a classroom. And it has worked over and over again for my students. One of them is the research. Choose books, again, that have had good reviews and bad ones, some that are banned, some that you have a good purpose for teaching, and go with a plan. Create a unit, say, this is what I want to do. This is how it meets the standards. Can I do it? Do the permission slips like Jeff says, that often works around here. But I find for my students that the biggest thing is going with a plan. How does this book, out of all the books in that room that they have, why this book, what purpose, what are you going to do? Show me the unit. So go with a plan in hand.
Well, thank you both. We have some great comments in the chat as well, people building off the things you've said. We're out of time, I'm afraid, but I want to thank Angela and Jeff. Thank you so much for the wonderful ideas you've shared with us, practical approaches, great resources, and have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.